The night was quiet, cloaked in a gentle breeze that whispered through the tall iron gates of the grand palace. Under the pale light of the moon, a small figure huddled on the cold, cobblestone path just outside the regal boundary. The girl couldn't have been older than 9, her dark skin glowing faintly under the moon's watchful gaze. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her head resting atop them, as if trying to disappear into herself. She wore a thin, worn-out dress, its fabric too frail to shield her from the chilling wind, and on her feet, mismatched socks peeked out from barely held-together shoes. The guards, stationed at the gate, were accustomed to a life of discipline and formality. They stood like statues, their crimson uniforms and tall black hats symbolizing authority and tradition. For years, they had seen diplomats, royals, and important visitors pass through these gates, but never had a child like this come so close. At first, they thought she might be lost, or perhaps the child of a guest waiting for her family. But as the hours stretched into the deep of night, it became clear she wasn't leaving. One guard, Corporal David, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. Unlike his stoic colleagues, David had a soft spot for children. He had grown up in a modest neighborhood, his family scraping by but rich in love. Seeing the little girl, alone and so vulnerable, stirred memories he couldn't suppress. "She's just a child," he muttered under his breath, breaking the heavy silence. His partner, a senior guard known for his strict adherence to protocol, barely spared the girl a glance. "Not our concern," he replied coldly. "She'll leave when she's ready. Our job is to protect the palace, not babysit strays." But David couldn't let it go. He glanced again at the girl, noticing the way her small frame shivered in the night air. Something about her posture, so still, so resigned, pulled at his heart. Against his better judgment, he took a step closer to the gate, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Excuse me, miss," he called out gently, his voice low so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The girl stirred slightly but didn't lift her head. For a moment, it seemed she might not respond at all. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured, I'm waiting." David exchanged a puzzled look with his partner, who rolled his eyes and muttered something about soft-hearted rookies. Ignoring him, David crouched down by the gate, his concern deepening. Waiting for what? He pressed, trying to keep his tone calm and inviting. The girl finally lifted her head, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "For someone who will listen," she said, her words heavy with a sadness that didn't belong in a child's voice. David felt his chest tighten. What could a child like her be carrying that no one had cared to hear? "You're safe here," he assured her, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "You can tell me." The girl hesitated, her small hands clutching the fabric of her dress, as if searching for strength. She looked up at him, her eyes glimmering with a mix of fear and determination. "I have to find the Queen," she said finally, her voice trembling but firm. David blinked, taken aback. The Queen? Of all the things he expected her to say, this wasn't it. He glanced over his shoulder at the grand palace behind him, its windows glowing faintly like stars against the night sky. "The Queen?" he repeated, trying to mask his surprise. "Why do you need to see her?" The girl's gaze dropped again, and she fidgeted with the frayed hem of her dress. "It's about my mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. She's in trouble. The Queen is the only one who can help." David felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He wanted to ask more, to understand what had brought her to this desperate conclusion. But before he could speak, the senior guard intervened. "This is nonsense," he snapped, stepping forward. "She's either lost or making up stories. We can't have random people, let alone children, loitering at the palace gates." The harshness of his tone made the girl shrink back, her fragile courage crumbling. But David stood his ground, his jaw tightening. "She's not a threat," he said firmly. "And if she's here, there's a reason. At least let's hear her out." The older guard scoffed, but didn't argue further. David turned back to the girl, his voice softening. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. Amara. "All right, Amara," he said gently. "Can you tell me what's going on? Why do you think the Queen can help?" Amara's lips quivered, and fresh tears welled in her eyes. She looked away, her small shoulders trembling. It's hard to explain," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "But if I don't find her soon, it'll be too late. Please, you have to believe me." David felt a pang of urgency in her words, but before he could press further, the sound of distant footsteps echoed in the stillness. Both guards turned, their training kicking in as they prepared for whatever was approaching. Amara, too, looked up, her face pale with fear. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, a tall, imposing man dressed in dark clothing. His expression was unreadable, but the way his eyes flicked toward Amara made her flinch. "There you are," he said, his voice smooth but chilling. "You've caused quite the trouble tonight." David instinctively stepped between the man and the girl, his protective instincts flaring. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone trying to take care of what's his," he replied. Amara's small hand gripped David's sleeve tightly, and she whispered, "Don't let him take me." David glanced down at her, his resolve hardening. Whatever was happening here, it was far from simple. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't let her go without finding out the truth. David's heart pounded as he stood between Amara and the man who had appeared so suddenly. The child's grip on his sleeve tightened, her small fingers trembling with fear. Her eyes darted nervously between David and the man, and the sheer terror on her face was enough to solidify David's stance. Something wasn't right. This man wasn't just looking for a child who had wandered off. There was a darkness about him, a coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver down David's spine. The man took a step closer, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the gravel. He wasn't dressed like someone who belonged to the palace staff or even the nearby town. His long coat and sharp, calculated movements made him stand out. "Come now," the man said, his voice calm but laced with an unsettling undertone. "You've had your fun, running off like that. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Amara shook her head furiously, her tears spilling over. "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "I'm not going with you. You're not my family." Her words rang out in the stillness, her desperation echoing in the air. David's partner, clearly annoyed by the unfolding drama, stepped forward. "Look, this is none of our concern," he said bluntly. "The child obviously knows this man. We should let him take her and be done with it." "No," David said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. He turned to his partner, his expression fierce. "Something's not right here. Look at her. She's terrified. You think that's normal?" The senior guard crossed his arms, his face set in a scowl. "You're being overly emotional, David. We're not social workers. Our job is to protect the palace, not mediate personal disputes." David ignored him and turned back to the man. "Who are you exactly?" he demanded. "And why is this girl so scared of you?" The man's faint smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm her guardian," he said smoothly. "She's had a rough time lately and, well, you know how kids can be. Overly dramatic. She just needs to come home and get some rest." Amara's voice rose in protest, her small body trembling with emotion. "You're lying," she shouted. "You're not my guardian. You hurt my mom, and now you're trying to take me away." David's stomach twisted at her words. He glanced down at her, searching her face for any hint of exaggeration or falsehood, but all he saw was raw, unfiltered fear. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, even though he barely knew her or her story. The man's demeanor shifted, his frustration beginning to show. "Look, I didn't have time for this," he said, his voice hardening. "You don't know what we're dealing with. Hand her over before this gets messy." David straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his belt. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until we figure out what's going on here." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment David thought he might lunge forward. But then the man stepped back, his expression cooling. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, his words dripping with warning. People like you, they don't understand the bigger picture. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. David knew this wasn't the end of it. The man would be back, and he wouldn't come alone. David exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. He crouched down to Amara's level, his voice soft but urgent. Amara, listen to me. I need to know what's going on. Who was that man? Why is he after you? Amara wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her breath hitching as she tried to calm herself. He's bad, she said, her voice shaky. He took my mom away. I don't know where she is, but that she told me to run to come here. She said the Queen could help us. David's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of her story. Why the Queen? He asked gently. Does your mom know her? Amara hesitated, as if she wasn't sure how much to say. My mom, she worked for someone important, she said finally. She said she found something out, something dangerous. That's why they came for her. She told me to find the Queen because she's the only one who can stop them. David felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a scared child or a family dispute. Whatever Amara's mother had discovered was enough to put both their lives in danger. And now, by helping her, David had become part of it. His partner scoffed, breaking the tense silence. This is ridiculous, he said. A little girl with some wild story about conspiracies and queens, you're letting her imagination run wild. David stood, his eyes locking onto his partner's. If you don't want to be involved, fine, he said coldly. But I'm not turning my back on her. The older guard threw up his hands in exasperation. Suit yourself. But when this blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you. David ignored him and turned back to Amara. We'll figure this out, he promised her. But first, you need to get out of the cold. Come with me. Amara hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What if he comes back? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He won't get to you, David said firmly. Not while I'm here. With that, he guided her through a sonic gate and into the small guard station just inside the palace grounds. The room was sparse but warm, with a wooden bench and a small heater in the corner. David grabbed a blanket from a storage cabinet and wrapped it around her shoulders. Thank you, Amara said softly, her voice carrying a mix of relief and exhaustion. David sat down across from her, his mind spinning with questions. Who was that man? What had Amara's mother uncovered that was so dangerous? And why did she believe the Queen could help? As he watched Amara clutch the blanket tightly, her small frame still trembling, David realized he had a choice to make. He could turn her over to the authorities and wash his hands of the situation, or he could dig deeper, risking his career and possibly his safety to uncover the truth. But deep down, he already knew what he would do. Something about Amara's fear, her courage, and the quiet determination in her eyes told him that this was a fight worth taking on. Whatever lay ahead, he wouldn't let her face it alone. The small guard station felt eerily quiet despite the occasional crackle from the old heater. Amara sat on the bench, her knees drawn up and the blanket wrapped tightly around her. Her wide, frightened eyes darted around the room as though she expected the man to burst through the door any moment. David leaned against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed, trying to figure out the best course of action. His mind churned with questions, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. Amara, he said softly, crouching down so he could meet her gaze. Do you remember anything specific your mom told you? Anything about what she found or why she thought the Queen could help? Amara bit her lip, her small fingers nervously twisting the edge of the blanket. She said it was something about the palace, she whispered. Something big. She didn't tell me everything, just that it was dangerous. She said some people were doing bad things, and if anyone could stop them, it was the Queen. David frowned. The palace. This was starting to sound bigger than he'd imagined. If Amara's mother had uncovered something connected to the royal family or their operations, It explained why someone might go to great lengths to silence her. But what could it be? Corruption? A secret deal? Something worse? Before he could ask more, his radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. "Corporal David," came a voice from the other end. It was the chief of the guard, his tone sharp and commanding. "Report to the main gate immediately. We've received a complaint about unauthorized activity." David's stomach sank. He glanced at Amara, who looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. "Stay here," he said firmly, his voice low. "Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone but me. Understand?" She nodded quickly, her small hands clutching the blanket like a lifeline. David stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. The crisp night air hit him like a wave, and he moved quickly toward the main gate, his mind racing. He knew what this was about. The man had wasted no time escalating the situation, likely spinning a story to make David look like the one in the wrong. As he approached, he saw the chief of the guard waiting with a stern expression, flanked by 2 other guards. Standing across from them was the man, his face calm, but his eyes gleaming with cold determination. "There he is," the man said smoothly, gesturing toward David. "I'd like to know why your guard is interfering in private matter." David stopped a few paces away, his posture rigid. "Because it's not a private matter when a child is terrified and claiming she's in danger," he said evenly. The chief's eyes narrowed. "David, what's going on here?" "I'm getting conflicting reports. This gentleman says you're withholding his ward, a runaway child." David felt his jaw tighten. "That's not the truth," he said firmly. "The girl says she's not his ward. She claims he hurt her mother and is trying to take her. She's scared out of her mind, Chief." The man sighed theatrically, shaking his head. "Children have vivid imaginations," he said. "She's been through a lot. Her mother, well, she's not in a position to care for her right now, so it's fallen to me. I'm just trying to do the right thing." "Why is she so afraid of you then?" David shot back. "Why does she think her mother's in danger?" The man's calm facade slipped for just a moment, his eyes flashing with irritation. "She's confused," he said, his tone clipped. "You're letting her fear cloud your judgment. Let me take her home, where she belongs." The chief glanced between them, his expression unreadable. "David, is the child safe?" "She's safe," David said quickly. "I've got her in the guard station, but I'm telling you, Chief, something isn't adding up. This man," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's something off about him. We need to investigate this before we hand her over." The chief looked at the man, then back at David. After a long, tense silence, he sighed. "Fine. We'll keep the girl here for now. But if you're wrong, David, this is on you." David nodded, relief washing over him. But he knew this was only a temporary solution. The man wasn't going to give up that easily, and David didn't trust him to play fair. When David returned to the guard station, he found Amara sitting exactly where he'd left her. Her eyes lit up with a mix of hope and fear when she saw him. "Is he gone?" she asked quietly. "For now," David said, locking the door behind him. "But he's not going to stop, Amara. We need to figure out what's really going on." Amara nodded, her small face set with determination. "I'll tell you everything I know," she said. "But you have to promise. Promise you'll help my mom." "I promise," David said without hesitation, "whatever it takes." Amara began to talk, her words halting at first, but gaining strength as she went on. She told him about her mother, a housekeeper who had worked for someone connected to the palace. She didn't know all the details, but she remembered overhearing late-night phone calls, whispered arguments, and the sound of her mother crying when she thought no one could hear. "She told me she found out something about money," Amara said, frowning as she tried to recall. "Something about people taking it and hiding it. She said it was wrong, and she wanted to tell someone, but she didn't know who to trust." David's mind raced. Embezzlement, fraud, whatever it was serious enough for someone to send a man like that after her. And if the palace was involved. "Do you know who your mom worked for?" he asked. Amara shook her head. She never told me their name. But I remember she had a card with a gold crown on it. She kept it in a little box under her bed. David frowned, his instincts telling him this was more than just a random detail. "Do you still have that card?" he asked. Amara shook her head again, her eyes filling with tears. "It's at home? I don't know if it's even safe there anymore." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said. "But for now, you're staying here. You're safe with me." Amara nodded, but her fear hadn't completely faded. And deep down, David knew she had every reason to be afraid. Whatever they were up against, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. David couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. Every minute Amara spent in the small guard station felt like a countdown to something much bigger, something that neither of them could fully grasp yet. He paced the length of the room, his mind racing with questions and half-formed plans. Amara sat quietly on the bench, the blanket draped over her shoulders, watching him with wary eyes. "Amara," he said suddenly, stopping mid-step. "Your house, where is it? Is it far from here?" She hesitated, as if the answer might cause more problems than it solved. "Not too far," she said finally. "It's in the town, near the big market. But I don't think it's safe to go there. He knows where it is." David nodded, already anticipating her concern. "We might not have a choice," he said. "If there's anything there that can help us figure out what's going on, like that card you mentioned, we need to get it." Her small hands twisted the edge of the blanket as she considered his words. "What if he's waiting for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll be careful," David promised. "I won't let anything happen to you, okay?" Amara gave a reluctant nod, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. David knew it was a risk, but sitting here and waiting wasn't an option. The man wasn't going to back off, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. He called the chief on his radio, keeping his voice low. "I need a favor," he said. "I'm taking the girl into town to check something out. Can you cover for me if anyone asks?" The chief's exasperated sigh crackled through the speaker. "David, you're already walking a thin line, if this goes south." "I know," David cut in, "but I don't have a choice. Just cover for me." There was a pause, and then the chief muttered, "Fine, but be careful." David tucked the radio away and turned back to Amara. "Let's go," he said. "We'll move quickly and stay out of sight." They slipped out of the guard station under the cover of darkness, sticking to the quieter paths that led into town. David kept Amara close, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The streets were nearly empty, the usual bustling market stalls abandoned for the night. The silence felt oppressive, every small sound magnified by their tension. When they reached Amara's house, David stopped a few steps away, his instincts screaming caution. The small weathered building looked ordinary enough, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He crouched down to Amara's level, his voice low. "Stay close to me," he said. "If anything feels wrong, we leave. Got it?" She nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. Together, they approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar. David's stomach twisted. He pushed the door open with one hand, his other resting on the button of his belt. The inside of the house was eerily quiet, the faint smell of overturned furniture and dust hanging in the air. Amara's steps faltered, her eyes wide as she took in the disarray. The small living room was in shambles, the cushions from the sofa scattered across the floor and a broken lamp lying in pieces near the wall. "They've been here," she whispered, her voice trembling. David crouched down and gently turned her toward him. "Do you know where the box is?" he asked. "The one with the card?" She nodded quickly. "In my mom's room. Under the bed." He stood and motioned for her to stay close as they moved through the house. The tension in the air was suffocating, every creak of the floorboards making his heart pound. When they reached the bedroom, David stopped in the doorway, scanning the room for any signs of danger. It was just as chaotic as the living room, with drawers pulled out and their contents dumped onto the floor. Amara slipped past him and knelt by the bed, her small hands trembling as she reached underneath. After a moment, she pulled out a small wooden box, its surface scratched and worn. "This is it," she said, holding it out to him. David took the box and opened it carefully. Inside was the card she described, its surface embossed with a gold crown. Alongside it was a folded piece of paper, which he unfolded to reveal a list of names and dates. His brow furrowed as he scanned it. The names weren't familiar, but the dates coincided with recent palace events. "This is important," he said, tucking the card and paper into his jacket. "Your mom was onto something, Amara. This could be what she was trying to protect." Before Amara could respond, a faint sound reached them, a muffled shuffle from somewhere in the house. David froze, his hand instinctively moving to the baton at his side. He motioned for Amara to stay quiet, his heart racing as he listened. The sound came again, closer this time. David's pulse quickened as he stepped in front of Amara, his eyes fixed on the open doorway. A shadow moved across the hallway, and then the man appeared, his cold eyes locking onto them. "Well," the man said, his voice calm but menacing, "I knew you'd come here eventually." Amara shrunk back, her fingers clutching David's sleeve. David tightened his grip on the baton, his mind racing. The man's posture was relaxed, but there was a dangerous edge to him, a confidence that made David's stomach churn. "You've got what doesn't belong to you," the man said, his gaze flicking to David's jacket. "Hand it over, and I might let you walk out of here." David didn't move. "If this doesn't belong to me," he said evenly, "then it doesn't belong to you either. I'm not giving you anything." The man's faint smile disappeared, replaced by a cold glare. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Maybe not," David said, "but I know you're not getting this." The tension in the room was unbearable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Amara clung to David's side, her small frame trembling, but her presence grounded him. He couldn't let this man win, not after everything Amara and her mother had been through. The man took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. David's muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at him to protect the child behind him. The confrontation was inevitable, and David knew they were moments away from it erupting into something far more dangerous. The tension in the room was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. David's grip tightened on the baton as the man took another step forward, his calculated movements a reminder that he held some advantage David couldn't yet see. Amara pressed herself against David's back, her breathing shallow and quick, her small hand clutching the fabric of his jacket, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "You're brave," the man said, his voice low and edged with a sinister calm. "But bravery only gets you so far. Walk away now, and you won't have to find out what happens when people cross the wrong line." David didn't budge. "You've already crossed too many lines," he said. "You're not getting this card, and you're not touching Amara." The man's smirk flickered, and for the first time David saw something crack through his facade: frustration. It was subtle, but it was there, and it told David he was closer to the truth than the man wanted him to be. Then, without warning, the man reached into his coat. David tensed, bracing himself for whatever was coming, but the man didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a phone and held it up, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. "Maybe you don't care about your own safety," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "But what about hers?" David's heart sank as the man tapped the screen, and an image popped up. A woman sitting at a small, cluttered desk, her face pale and drawn, her hands bound behind her back. Amara gasped, a sound so small yet so full of despair that it broke something inside David. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me make this very simple," the man continued, his gaze shifting between David and Amara. "Hand over the card and the paper, and this all ends quietly. I'll let her go. You can walk away, no worse for wear. But if you keep pushing this," he trailed off, letting the unspoken threat hang heavy in the air. David's mind raced. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and the weight of Amara's terrified gaze burned into him. If the man had Amara's mother, then this wasn't just about money or palace secrets. It was about control, about silencing anyone who might expose the truth. David didn't know the full extent of what he was dealing with, but one thing was clear. Giving the man what he wanted wasn't going to solve anything. It would only make him more dangerous. "You expect me to believe you'll just let her go?" David said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "You've already lied about who you are. You've hurt people. Why will I trust you now?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression a mix of amusement and annoyance. "Trust is a luxury we don't have time for," he said. "But I'm not the villain you've decided I am. I'm just doing my job." David's jaw tightened. Hurting innocent people isn't a job, it's a choice. And you've made the wrong one. The man sighed as if bored with the conversation. "Believe what you want, but you've got two options. Give me the card, or watch things get much worse." Before David could respond, a faint creak echoed from the hallway behind the man. His head snapped around, his calm demeanor fracturing as he spun to face the sound. For a moment, David thought it might be one of the neighbors or perhaps even the chief coming to back him up. But the figure that emerged from the shadows made David's blood run cold. It was another man, dressed in dark clothing similar to the first. But unlike the polished, calculating figure in front of David, this new arrival had a rougher edge to him, his movements jerky, his expression wild and unpredictable. He carried himself like someone who thrived on chaos, and the glint in his eyes sent a chill down David's spine. "You're taking too long," the new man growled, his voice sharp and impatient. "Boss isn't happy." The first man's calm facade cracked further, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes before he quickly masked it. "I've got it under control," he snapped. "Stay out of it." "Doesn't look like it," the second man shot back, his gaze shifting to David and Amara. His eyes narrowed, and a slow, unsettling grin spread across his face. This must be the little brat causing all the trouble. Cute kid. Shame she got mixed up in this. Amara shrank further behind David, her small body trembling like a leaf in the wind. David shifted his stance, placing himself more firmly between her and the two men. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was laser-focused. This second man was a wild card, unpredictable and dangerous. Whatever leverage David might have had before was quickly slipping away. The second man took a step closer, his movements deliberate and menacing. "Let's just take the card and the kid," he said, his tone casual but laced with malice. "Boss doesn't care how we do it, as long as it gets done." "Stay back," David warned, his voice sharp and commanding. He raised the baton slightly, his grip firm. "You're not touching her." The first man held up a hand, a clear attempt to maintain control of the situation. "Enough," he said, his tone clipped. "We're not making this messier than it needs to be." The second man chuckled darkly, clearly enjoying the tension. "You're too soft. That's your problem." David's mind raced, trying to find a way out of this escalating nightmare. He didn't have backup, and the odds were stacked against him. But he couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not with Amara's life, and her mother's, hanging in the balance. Then, as if the universe had decided to add one more layer of chaos, a loud noise erupted outside, the unmistakable blare of a siren cutting through the night. The two men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. David's heart leaped at the sudden interruption. Someone had called for help, or perhaps the chief had sent reinforcements after all. Whatever the reason, it was the distraction he needed. "Run," David hissed to Amara, pushing her toward the back door. She hesitated for only a second before darting away, a small figure disappearing into the shadows. David turned back to the men, his baton raised, ready for whatever came next. He wasn't going down without a fight. The blaring siren seemed to shake the entire neighborhood, a piercing sound that sent the two men into a flurry of confusion. The first man barked something under his breath, his composed demeanor unraveling as he shot a glare at the second. David used their distraction to back toward the hallway, keeping his baton raised and his eyes sharp. Every step was a calculated move, his focus split between the two men and the direction Amara had fled. "Let's move," the first man snapped to his partner, glancing toward the door as the siren grew louder. "We didn't have time for this." The second man growled in frustration, his wild energy turning into barely contained rage. "You're letting them slip away. The boss won't." "Enough." The first man cut him off, his voice sharp and commanding. "This isn't over. We'll finish it another way." David could see the cracks forming between them, their conflicting temperaments pulling them in opposite directions. He seized the moment, darting toward the back door while they argued. Every muscle in his body screamed for speed, but he forced himself to move quietly, knowing any noise could draw their attention back to him. The cool night air hit him as he slipped into the backyard. He scanned the shadows frantically, relief flooding through him when he spotted Amara crouched behind an old tool shed, her small frame barely visible in the darkness. He motioned for her to stay low and silent, his heart pounding as he heard the men's voices rise inside the house. "They're gone," the second man shouted angrily. "This is on you." "Shut up," the first man snapped. "We'll regroup. The girl has nowhere to go." David knew they wouldn't stay long with the sirens drawing closer, but he also knew they were right. Without help, he and Amara couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. Fast. As the men's voices faded, David crept over to Amara, kneeling beside her. She looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, her small hands clutching the blanket she brought with her. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to help her." "We will," David promised, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. "But first, we need to get somewhere safe." Amara hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the house. "What if they hurt her?" she asked, her voice breaking. David placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her eyes. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "I need you to trust me, okay?" She nodded, her small frame trembling but determined. Together, they slipped through the yard and onto a quiet side street, keeping to the shadows as the sirens grew louder in the distance. David led Amara toward the edge of town, where the lights of the palace gleamed faintly against the night sky. It was a long shot, but he knew it was their only hope. The palace guard had resources, connections. Someone there would have to listen. As they approached the palace gates, David's mind raced with how to explain everything. The royal guard on duty was already on high alert, the sirens having reached their ears as well. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster, as he eyed David and Amara warily. "State your business," the guard demanded. David raised his hands slowly, trying to convey that he wasn't a threat. "We need help," he said. "There's a little girl involved. Her mother's in danger. And there's something bigger going on, something tied to the palace." The guard's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Amara stepped forward, clutching the card David had handed her earlier. "This," she said, her voice small but clear. "It's about this." The guard's expression shifted as he took the card, his brow furrowing as he examined it. David could see the recognition in his eyes, the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders. The guard exchanged a quick look with his partner, then gestured for them to follow. Inside the palace, the tension was palpable. They were led to a private chamber where a high-ranking officer met them, his sharp eyes scanning the card and the folded paper David had handed over. As he read, his expression darkened, and David felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "This is troubling," the officer said finally, his voice low. "The names on this list, they're connected to key events in the palace. And this card, it's an access token. Someone's been using it to manipulate decisions from the shadows." David felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Amara's mother was still in danger. "We need to act now," he said. "There are 2 men out there, dangerous men. They have her mother." The officer nodded grimly. "We'll deploy a team immediately. But this goes deeper than you realize. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a case of abduction. It's a conspiracy." Before David could respond, another guard entered the room, his face pale. He whispered something to the officer, who stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Turning back to David, the officer said, "We've just received word. The men you described have been apprehended near the outskirts of town. But there's more." They weren't alone. David's heart sank. Who else? The officer hesitated, then gestured for them to follow him. In a security room, a monitor displayed live footage of the captured men. Beside them was a woman, bound, pale, but alive. Amara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Mom," she cried, tears streaming down her face. But David's relief was short-lived as the officer pointed to another screen. It showed a figure in the shadows, moving toward a hidden exit. The grainy footage was enough to confirm what David had feared. Someone else was pulling the strings, and they were still out there. "It's not over," the officer said grimly. "Not yet." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Amara's tearful cry still echoed softly in the air, her face pressed against David's side as she clung to him with all her strength. On the monitors, the scene unfolded slowly, but with unnerving clarity. Amara's mother was alive, visibly shaken but unharmed for the moment. The two captured men sat in restrained defiance, their postures tense, as if waiting for their leader to emerge and take control. David turned to the officer, urgency burning in his voice. "You have to catch that person," he said, pointing to the figure on the screen. "They're the one orchestrating all of this. If they get away, everything we've done tonight will mean nothing." The officer nodded sharply, already barking orders into his radio. "Lock down every exit. I want teams covering all perimeters immediately. No one gets out." Amara tugged at David's sleeve, her voice small but insistent. "What about Mom? Can we go to her?" David knelt, meeting her eyes. "We will," he said gently, "but right now, we need to make sure the people who did this can't hurt anyone else. Your mom's safe. They won't let anything happen to her." Amara nodded, trusting him despite the fear still etched on her face. David squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, then rose to follow the officer. The palace halls were a flurry of activity as guards moved with purpose, their boots echoing against the marble floors. Down in the holding area, Amara's mother sat with two medics, who were carefully examining her. When she saw Amara, her eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to her feet, her hands still trembling. "Amara," she cried, her voice breaking. "Mom." Amara ran to her, throwing her arms around her waist and holding on tightly. For a moment, the chaos of the night seemed to fade as they clung to each other. David stood back, watching the reunion with a sense of relief that was quickly overshadowed by the weight of unfinished business. The mastermind was still out there, and every second they remained free was another opportunity for them to escape. The officer returned, his expression grave but determined. "We've cornered the suspect," he said. "They're in the lower tunnels. It's only a matter of time now." David felt a flicker of hope, but kept his focus. "I want to help," he said. "This isn't just about stopping them. It's about making sure the truth comes out." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Come with me." They descended into the lower levels of the palace, where the air was cooler and the light dimmer. The tunnels were a maze of narrow passageways and hidden doors designed centuries ago as an escape route for the royal family. Now they served as the setting for final confrontation. The guards had the figure cornered in a dead-end corridor. The suspect stood with their back to the wall, their face obscured by a hood. David could feel the tension crackling in the air as he stepped forward, the officer by his side. "It's over," the officer said firmly. "There's nowhere left to run." The figure didn't move at first, their silence unnerving. Then slowly they lifted their hands and pulled back the hood. David's breath caught as the face was revealed, not a stranger, but someone he recognized from the palace itself. It was a senior advisor, someone trusted and respected by those in power. "You?" David said, disbelief coloring his tone. "Why? Why would you do this?" The advisor's lips curved into a bitter smile. "You wouldn't understand," they said, their voice steady despite the circumstances. "This palace, this system, it's all built on lies. I was trying to fix it, to expose the corruption and rebuild something better. David shook his head, anger rising. You didn't fix anything. You hurt innocent people. You used a child, our family, to push your agenda. That's not justice. That's cruelty. The advisor's gaze flickered, a flash of something like regret crossing their face. Sometimes, they said quietly, you have to break things to rebuild them. Not like this, David said firmly. Not at the expense of lives. The guards moved in, placing the advisor in restraints. As they were led away, David felt a mix of emotions, relief that it was over, but also a lingering sadness for the damage done. The night had uncovered secrets and shattered illusions, but it had also brought moments of courage and resilience embodied in Amara and her unyielding love for her mother. Back in the main halls, Amara and her mother sat together, their bond unshaken despite the night's horrors. David joined them, his presence a steady reassurance. The officer approached, his expression softer now. You've done more than we could have asked, he said to David. This palace owes you and this family a debt. David nodded, his mind already shifting to what came next. What happens now? He asked. The advisor will face justice, the officer said, and will ensure Amara and her mother are protected. They'll be given everything they need to rebuild their lives. Amara looked up at David, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said simply, her voice carrying more weight than words alone could express. David smiled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. You're stronger than you know, Amara, he said. Never forget that. As dawn broke over the palace, the first light of day felt like a symbol of renewal. The past couldn't be changed, but the future held promise. David walked out of the palace gates, knowing the world wasn't perfect, but feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes he realized doing the right thing wasn't about grand gestures. It was about protecting the people who needed it most, even in the face of impossible odds. And as he glanced back at the tower and gates, he knew one thing for certain. Amara's story wasn't just one of hardship. It was one of hope, resilience, and the strength to face whatever came next.